And of course, the initial investment. That was the real risk, you know? Leaving a stable corporate position, betting everything on a vision that existed only in my head. Natalie Brennan cut her chicken with precise, even strokes, the knife meeting the plate without sound. Across the table, Derek held court among 6 of his business associates, his wine glass tilted in that casual way that suggested both confidence and availability. She'd seen this performance 100 times. Maybe more. How much did you start with, if you don't mind my asking? This from Richard, one of Derek's newer clients, a man who wore his wealth with the subtle arrogance of inheritance. Derek smiled, paused just long enough to suggest humility. 40,000. Everything we had. Natalie registered the pronoun, placed her fork down, reached for her water glass. The words sat in her mouth like something that had spoiled. That's incredible, Richard's wife, Angela, Adrienne, leaned forward. I don't think I could handle that kind of uncertainty. Did you have family support at least? Just each other, Derek said, and the table made approving sounds, the kind of soft murmurs that accompany stories of romantic partnership and shared sacrifice. It was terrifying and exhilarating, but I knew if I didn't take the risk then, I'd regret it forever. Natalie sipped her water. The glass was cold. She focused on that, the temperature, the condensation against her palm, instead of the way Derek's story had carefully edited out whose family the 40,000 had come from. Her grandmother's funeral had been on a Tuesday. They'd deposited the inheritance check on Friday. Derek had submitted his resignation the following Monday. But that version didn't fit the narrative of the self-made man, so it simply ceased to exist in his telling. And Natalie, Richard turned to her with the polite attention people extend to quiet women at dinner parties. Derek mentioned you were in finance too before. Do you miss it? Before she could answer, Derek's hand reached across the table, patted hers with affectionate dismissal. She was in equity analysis, smart enough to know when to step back and let someone else take the wheel. He squeezed her fingers once, released them. Can't build a company when you're both working 80-hour weeks. Someone has to hold down the fort. Light laughter circled the table. Natalie smiled, the expression requiring no thought after years of practice. She didn't correct the story, that she'd worked contracts for the firm's first 2 years while Derek built client relationships, that her analysis had landed 3 of their first 5 major accounts, that stepping back had been his suggestion framed as their mutual decision. She said, "I'm very proud of what he's built." And she meant it in a way none of them would understand. The conversation moved on as it always did, flowing around her like water around a stone. Natalie finished her meal, refilled wine glasses when they emptied, laughed softly at appropriate moments. She was good at this. She'd had years to perfect the choreography of being present without taking up space, but while Derek talked about expansion plans and market positioning, while his colleagues nodded and asked questions that fed his expertise, Natalie was counting the number of times he said I versus we, counting the small edits to their shared history that erased her contributions, counting the seconds he held eye contact with Jennifer, his assistant, who'd arrived late and sat at the far end of the table wearing perfume Natalie didn't recognize but had smelled on Derek's collar 3 weeks ago. She wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger was hot and immediate and visible. What Natalie felt was colder than that. It was the same analytical clarity she used to apply to corporate balance sheets, the recognition of patterns, the identification of risk, the calculation of exposure. And Derek had no idea she was counting at all. The dinner party ended near 11. Natalie stood in the kitchen, rinsing wine glasses while voices carried from the foyer. Final goodbyes, promises to schedule lunch, the social maintenance that lubricated Derek's professional world. She heard Jennifer's laugh, bright and performative, followed by Derek's lower rumble. The front door closed. Footsteps in the hallway. Derek appeared in the kitchen doorway, loosening his tie. That went well. Richard's interested in the consulting package for his whole executive team. Could be a 6-figure contract. That's wonderful, Natalie said, placing a glass in the drying rack. You okay? You were quiet tonight. She smiled over her shoulder. Just tired. It was a lovely evening. Derek's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and Natalie saw it, the micro-expression that crossed his face before he controlled it. Surprise, then something like guilt, then careful neutrality. His thumb moved to dismiss the notification, but not before his other hand found his wedding ring, twisted it once around his finger. I need to take this, he said, already moving toward his office. Conference call with the West Coast team. Time zones, you know. Of course, Natalie said to his retreating back. The office door closed with a soft click. Natalie stood at the sink, hands submerged in warm water, and listened. The murmur of Derek's voice through the wall, too low to make out words, but pitched in that particular register he used, when he wanted to sound both authoritative and charming. The call lasted 14 minutes. She knew because she counted, her hands moving through the mechanical task of washing, while her mind tracked time with the precision of someone who'd learned that details mattered. When Derek emerged, he was smiling. All set. Sorry about that. No problem. I'm heading up. I'll be up soon. Just need to finish some emails. Natalie dried her hands, folded the towel with careful corners, and climbed the stairs to their bedroom. She changed into pajamas, washed her face, went through the motions of preparing for sleep while her thoughts moved in a different direction entirely. $40,000. Her grandmother's entire liquid estate, left to Natalie because she'd been the one who visited every Sunday, who'd listened to stories about the Depression and Victory Gardens and making do with less, who'd held her hand in hospice and promised to use the money wisely, to build something that would last. Derek had been so supportive during that time, so present. He'd come to the funeral, held Natalie while she cried, helped sort through her grandmother's small apartment. And when the estate check arrived, he'd suggested they use it to finally take the leap he'd been planning, start the consulting firm, build their future together. Our future. That's what he'd said then. Our risk, our sacrifice, our dream. Natalie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried to pinpoint when the pronouns had started changing. When had our business become my firm? When had we decided, shifted to I chose? The evolution had been so gradual she'd almost missed it, like watching someone age. You don't notice the lines forming until you compare them to old photographs. Derek came upstairs 40 minutes later, sliding into bed with the comfortable presumption of someone who had no reason to expect resistance. You sure you're okay? He asked, his hand finding her hip in the darkness. I'm fine, just thinking about Grandma. This time of year always makes me miss her. Derek made a sympathetic sound, squeezed her hip once, then rolled away. Within minutes his breathing deepened into sleep, easy and untroubled. Natalie lay awake for another hour, counting his breaths, and thought about the wedding ring twist he probably didn't even know he did. She thought about Jennifer's perfume. She thought about $40,000 that had become the initial investment, scrubbed clean of origin. And she thought about the fact that she'd spent 6 years analyzing financial structures professionally, identifying risk and exposure, before she'd become someone whose primary identity was managing a household and supporting someone else's ambition. Derek thought she'd set that expertise aside. That was his first mistake. The thing about running a household efficiently is that it becomes invisible. The more seamlessly things function, the less anyone notices the labor required to maintain that function. Natalie had learned this over 7 years of marriage. Derek's dry cleaning appeared in his closet, organized by garment type, without him ever thinking about the pickup and delivery schedule Natalie coordinated. His travel arrangements materialized in calendar invitations with flight confirmations, hotel reservations, and ground transportation. He just showed up at the airport. The house maintained itself, or so it seemed. Meals appearing at appropriate times, bills paid automatically, the lawn service scheduled, the gutters cleaned before autumn, the furnace service before winter. It was the kind of work that only became visible when it stopped happening. Natalie moved through her days with the precision of an operations manager, which is essentially what she was, except her title was wife, and her compensation was access to joint accounts that Derek controlled. She woke at 6, made coffee, prepared Derek's breakfast while he showered. By 7 he was out the door, usually with a distracted kiss on her cheek, and a reminder about some evening obligation she'd already calendared 3 weeks prior. Then the house was hers. Or more accurately, then she belonged to the house. Mondays, meal planning and grocery ordering. Tuesdays, coordinate service appointments. Wednesdays, handle the dry cleaning rotation, manage household finances. Thursdays, prepare for Derek's Friday client dinners. Fridays, execute whatever social obligation Derek's networking required. The routine was predictable, efficient, and completely erased her. 3 weeks after the dinner party, Natalie was sorting Derek's suits for cleaning when she found the bank statement. She almost missed it. The envelope was tucked into the interior pocket of his navy suit, the one he wore for major client presentations. The paper was folded in thirds, slightly rumpled, as if he'd read it quickly and shoved it away. Natalie pulled it out, intending to set it on his desk, when the account number caught her eye. She'd managed their household finances for 7 years. She knew their checking account number, their savings account, the business operating account Derek had given her View, only access to for tax purposes. She knew these numbers the way some people knew their children's birthdays. They were written into her understanding of their financial architecture. This number was different. Natalie unfolded the statement. The account was titled in Derek's name only. The balance was $47,283.16. The statement showed regular deposits, $3,000 in January, $5,000 in February, $8,000 in March. All transfers from the business account, categorized as owner distribution. Owner, singular. Natalie stood in their bedroom, holding the paper with hands that had gone very still, and felt something shift in her chest. Not panic. Not even surprise, really. It was more like confirmation, the moment when a pattern you'd been sensing crystallizes into clarity. She took her phone from her pocket, photographed the statement from 3 angles to ensure every detail was legible, then carefully refolded it and returned it to the exact position she'd found it. The suit went into the dry cleaning bag as planned. Her hands didn't shake, but her mind had already started calculating. $47,000 in one account she'd discovered by accident. How many others might exist that she hadn't found? And why would Derek need separate accounts unless he was preparing for financial separation? Natalie delivered the dry cleaning, came home, and did something she hadn't done in years. She opened her laptop and pulled up the business registry for their state. The consulting firm, Brennan Strategic Group, had been incorporated 8 years ago. Natalie remembered the paperwork process vaguely. She'd been recovering from pneumonia that winter, stuck in bed while Derek handled the administrative details. He'd brought documents to her to sign, explaining them quickly while she was fogged with fever and medication. She'd trusted him to handle it correctly. Now she pulled up the official filing. Corporate structure, single-member LLC, member Derek Michael Brennan. Natalie stared at the screen for a long time. She'd been there at the beginning. She'd worked the contracts while Derek built relationships. She'd done financial modeling, competitive analysis, client research. She had emails from that period. She'd checked, they were still in her archived folders, where clients thanked the Brennan team for deliverables she'd personally created. But on paper, legally, the business was entirely his, which meant her $40,000, her grandmother's legacy that was supposed to build their future, had become the seed capital for an asset Natalie had no legal claim to. She closed the laptop carefully, walked to the kitchen, and made herself tea with the same measured movements she used for everything. The kettle boiled. She poured water over the tea bag, watched the color bloom through the clear liquid, added honey. Her hands were completely steady. That evening, Derek came home excited about a potential expansion opportunity. He talked through dinner about opening a second office, hiring additional consultants, scaling the operation. "It's really happening," he said, refilling his wine glass. "Everything I've been working toward." "That's wonderful," Natalie said. "I've been thinking about the financial structure too. Might make sense to create some separate entities for tax purposes, move some assets around. My accountant has ideas." "I'm sure you'll make the right choice." Derek smiled at her, the expression warm with the confidence of someone whose decisions had never been seriously questioned. "You've always been so supportive. I know this hasn't been the life you probably imagined, me working crazy hours, you handling everything here, but it's going to pay off, all of it." Natalie wondered what version of pay off he was imagining. Whether it included her, or whether she'd already been written out of that future the same way she'd been edited from the business incorporation. "I believe you," she said, and meant something entirely different than he heard. That night, after Derek fell asleep, Natalie lay awake doing math. If the business was worth what Derek had recently mentioned to colleagues, approximately $2 million based on the pending major contract, and she had no legal ownership stake despite contributing the seed capital and 2 years of unpaid labor, then, in a divorce, she'd be entitled to, what? Potentially half the marital assets, but if Derek had been systematically moving money into separate accounts, those assets could be significantly less than they appeared. She thought about the $40,000, about her grandmother's hands, paper thin and spotted with age, pressing the checkbook into Natalie's palm. "Build something good," she'd whispered. "Something that lasts." Natalie had thought she was building a partnership. She'd been building Derek's empire instead. The realization didn't make her angry. Not yet. It made her focused. Over the following weeks, Natalie began to pay attention differently. She started checking the mail before Derek got home, a small adjustment to her routine that he didn't notice because he'd never tracked her daily movements. Most days brought nothing interesting: utility bills, promotional materials, the occasional bank statement for accounts she already knew about. But on a Thursday in late April, there was an envelope from a brokerage firm she didn't recognize. Natalie held it up to the window. The paper was too thick to read through. She set it on the counter, made herself coffee, and considered her options. She could leave it for Derek, pretend she'd never been curious. She could ask him directly what account this was, why she didn't know about it. Or she could find out for herself what he'd chosen not to tell her. Natalie put the kettle on to boil, held the envelope over the steam until the adhesive loosened, and carefully opened it. Account statement. Titled in Derek's name alone. Balance, $83,447.29. Holdings, a diversified portfolio of index funds and bonds. Conservative, intelligent investing. The kind of portfolio you built when you were preparing for long-term financial security. Individual long-term financial security. Natalie photographed the statement, resealed the envelope with fresh adhesive from the craft supplies she kept for holiday cards, and placed it in the stack of Derek's mail. That evening, she watched him sort through it. He paused on the brokerage statement, glanced at her. She was chopping vegetables for dinner, humming softly, then took it to his office. He didn't mention it. She didn't ask. But now she knew to look. And once you know to look, patterns become visible everywhere. Derek had started doing laundry separately, claiming his gym clothes needed special detergent. He'd created a separate browser profile on the laptop they used to share, password protected. He took phone calls in the car, in the garage, anywhere Natalie wasn't. And the ring twist. God. The ring twist was constant now. Working late tonight, babe. Don't wait up. Twist. That smell? New cologne. Client gave it to me as a thank you gift. Twist. Weekend retreat next month. Team building thing, solo attendance required by the facilitator. Twist. Natalie said, okay, and that's fine, and have a good time. And she started building a file. She created a cloud storage account he didn't know about, using her maiden name and an email address she set up specifically for this purpose. Every statement she found, every document she photographed, every screenshot of conversations where Derek mentioned assets, all of it went into organized folders with dates and categories. She was good at this. She'd done financial analysis professionally. She knew how to build a documentation trail that would survive scrutiny. What surprised her was how much she'd retained. The skills she'd thought she'd lost by stepping away from equity analysis were still there, just dormant. Her mind fell back into the patterns of systematic investigation with the ease of muscle memory. It felt like waking up. In early May, Natalie received a call from Andrea Chen, a former colleague from her equity analysis days. I know this is completely out of the blue, Andrea said, but I'm working with a startup that needs competitive market analysis for their investor pitch. It's a small contract, maybe 15 hours of work, but I immediately thought of you. Are you doing any consulting? Natalie was sitting in her kitchen, looking at the meal plan she'd created for the week, and something inside her made a decision before her conscious mind caught up. I could be, she said. Really? I thought you'd stepped away from the industry. I stepped away from full-time work. I didn't stop thinking. Andrea laughed. God, I've missed working with you. You were the best analyst in our cohort. Can you start next week? They discussed scope, timeline, compensation. The contract would pay $2,800 for deliverables due within 3 weeks. It wasn't much, but it was hers. After they hung up, Natalie sat very still, feeling the weight of what she'd just agreed to. Then she opened her laptop and created a new business registration in her maiden name. Natalie Brennan had become Natalie Ashford for 7 years, but legally she could still use her birth name for professional purposes. She opened a bank account at a different institution than any she and Derek used. And when the contract payment arrived 3 weeks later, deposited into an account only she could access, Natalie understood something fundamental. She'd been thinking of herself as someone who used to be professionally competent. She was still that person. She'd just stopped practicing. Derek never asked about her days, so he never knew she'd spent them rebuilding the professional identity she'd set aside when she'd agreed to hold down the fort. He came home to clean houses and prepared meals, and a wife who smiled and nodded at appropriate times. He had no idea what she was doing in the hours he was gone. And that asymmetry, the gap between what he assumed and what was actually true, that was beginning to feel like power. By midsummer, Natalie had completed 4 consulting contracts and had a 5th in negotiation. Her professional network, dormant for years, had reactivated with surprising speed. Andrea referred her to 2 other clients. One of those clients mentioned her to a former professor who needed research assistance. The work compounded. She was making between $3,000 and $5,000 per month, all of it flowing into accounts Derek didn't know existed. It wasn't enough to make her financially independent. Not yet. But it was proof of concept, evidence that she could generate income, that her skills had market value, that she wasn't economically helpless. More than the money, the work gave her back something she'd lost without noticing, the experience of being listened to. Her clients read her analyses carefully, asked thoughtful questions, implemented her recommendations. They treated her expertise as valuable. It had been so long since Natalie had felt valuable for something other than her ability to manage Derek's comfort. She scheduled consulting calls for mid-morning, after Derek left for the office. She worked at the kitchen table, her laptop screen angled away from windows in case he ever came home unexpectedly. She kept all client communications in separate email accounts and messaging apps he had no access to. The compartmentalization required focus, but Natalie had always been good at managing complex systems. And she'd been practicing invisibility for years. Meanwhile, Derek's behavior patterns continued crystallizing. He'd started mentioning the future with increasing frequency, but always in singular terms. Where he might retire, what he wanted to do with his success, the timeline for selling the business eventually. Never we, never our plans. Just his vision, his goals, his exit strategy. In late July, Derek announced he'd be attending a weekend conference in a coastal city 3 hours away. It's a leadership intensive, he explained over dinner. Pretty exclusive, solo attendance only. They have this whole philosophy about individual transformation. His hand found his wedding ring. Twisted once. That sounds valuable, Natalie said. You don't mind? I know it's our anniversary weekend. Their anniversary. Natalie had forgotten, which told her something about the state of things she didn't want to examine too closely. Of course not. This is important for your development. Derek looked relieved. I'll make it up to you, promise. He left Friday afternoon. Natalie waved from the doorway, waited until his car disappeared, then went inside and did something she'd been planning for weeks. She went into Derek's home office. He kept it locked when he traveled, but Natalie had found the key months ago while organizing his desk drawer. She'd made a copy at the hardware store, returned the original to its exact position. Now she let herself in and began systematically photographing documents. Tax returns that showed business income she'd never seen reported. Partnership agreements for ventures he'd never mentioned. Correspondence with his attorney about asset protection strategies. A draft operating agreement for a new LLC with language about transferring certain holdings to shield them from future claims. Future claims. Like a divorce. Natalie photographed everything, her hands steady, her breathing controlled. She worked methodically, returning each document to its precise position, leaving no evidence of her presence. This wasn't anger driving her. It was something clearer than that. It was the recognition that Derek had been planning his exit strategy for months, maybe longer, and he'd assumed she was too naive or too trusting or too occupied with household management to notice. He'd mistaken her quietness for obliviousness. That was becoming an expensive mistake. When Derek returned from his weekend conference, he seemed distracted, distant. He spent Sunday evening on his laptop, barely acknowledging Natalie's presence. On Monday, he stayed home to take a video call in his office. The walls were thin enough that Natalie could hear the rhythm of conversation if not the specific words. Derek's voice, then a woman's voice, then laughter. When he emerged 2 hours later, he was wearing fresh cologne. I need to run to the office, he said. Forgot some files. On a Monday evening? You know how it is. Client emergency. Ring twist. Natalie nodded. I'll keep dinner warm. He didn't come home until after 10. The food had long since gone cold. Sorry, he said, kissing the top of her head with the absent affection of habit. Things got complicated. He smelled like wine and that cologne and something else. Perfume. The same scent Natalie had noticed months ago, the one Jennifer wore. "It's fine," Natalie said. "I'll make a plate for you." "Actually, I grabbed something at the office. I'm exhausted. Going to head up." He was asleep within minutes of his head hitting the pillow, the sleep of someone whose conscience wasn't troubling him at all. Natalie lay beside him in the dark, doing calculations. The business was approaching the final stages of a major deal Derek had been cultivating for 8 months. If it closed, and Derek seemed confident it would, the firm's valuation would triple. He'd mentioned this to colleagues at a recent dinner party, his voice full of pride and certainty. Once that deal closed, Derek would be sitting on an asset worth approximately $6 million, an asset legally titled entirely in his name. With separate accounts already established, money already being moved, infrastructure already in place to support his individual financial future. Natalie understood the timeline now. Derek was waiting until the deal closed, until his financial position was maximized, before he made his exit official. He was planning, strategizing, preparing the ground for a divorce that would happen on his terms, in his time frame, with assets positioned to his advantage. And he thought Natalie had no idea. She turned onto her side, watching his sleeping profile in the darkness, and made a decision. She wouldn't confront him. Confrontation would only accelerate his timeline and alert him to her awareness. He'd have explanations ready, justifications practiced. He'd spent years cultivating authority in professional settings. He knew how to control a narrative. No, Natalie would do what she'd been doing. She'd stay quiet. She'd watch. She'd document. And she'd prepare. Derek thought he was the only one planning a future. But while he'd been moving money and scheduling weekend conferences, Natalie had been rebuilding a professional identity, establishing financial independence, and creating a documentation trail that would survive any legal scrutiny. He'd taught her something valuable over the years. The person who controls the information controls the outcome. Derek just didn't realize she'd learned that lesson better than he'd intended. August became September, became October. The leaves changed. The air cooled. Natalie's consulting income increased to a steady $5,000 per month, sometimes more when projects overlapped. She'd moved beyond small contracts. One of her clients had been so impressed with her competitive analysis that they'd asked her to prepare materials for a board presentation. Another had referred her to their parent company. Andrea had started describing her as the best freelance analyst I know in professional circles. Natalie had built a reputation without advertising, without a website, purely through the quality of work that spoke for itself. She felt herself coming back into focus. The version of herself she'd been before marriage, sharp, analytical, confident in her professional judgment, hadn't disappeared. She'd just been quiet, waiting. Now she was remembering what it felt like to be visible for her competence instead of her accommodation. Derek noticed none of this. He was too occupied with his own trajectory. The major deal was entering final negotiations. Derek talked about it constantly, the words spilling out over dinner, during weekend mornings, any time his mind wasn't actively focused elsewhere. This contract would transform everything. The client was a Fortune 500 company. The engagement would span 3 years. The revenue projections were staggering. "This is it," he said one evening in mid-October, his eyes bright with anticipation. "This is what I've been building toward." First, what I've been building. Natalie had stopped counting the pronouns. The pattern was too consistent to require tracking. "I'm so proud of you," she said, and watched him accept the statement with the easy entitlement of someone who'd grown accustomed to admiration. That same week, Natalie did 3 things. First, she rented a storage unit 30 minutes outside town, paying cash for 6 months in advance under her maiden name. She began moving items with sentimental value. Her grandmother's jewelry, photograph albums from before her marriage, personal documents, a few pieces of furniture that had belonged to her family. Not everything. Just the pieces she couldn't risk losing. Derek didn't notice the gradual disappearance of these items because he'd never paid attention to them in the first place. Second, she compiled every piece of documentation she'd collected over the past 6 months. Bank statements, brokerage accounts, business filings, email screenshots, photographs of documents from Derek's office. She organized everything chronologically, cross-referenced by account and asset type, and created a summary document that outlined the complete financial picture. The file was 243 pages. She encrypted it, backed it up in 3 separate cloud locations, and gave one trusted former colleague a sealed envelope with access instructions to be opened if anything happened to Natalie. Not because she expected Derek to be dangerous, but because information this valuable needed protection. Third, she made an appointment with an attorney. Not locally. Derek knew every lawyer in their town. He'd worked with most of them at some point, cultivated relationships at the country club and the Rotary Club and all the other professional networks he'd spent years building. Natalie called a firm 3 towns over, a practice that specialized in complex divorce cases involving business assets and financial concealment. She paid the consultation fee in cash from her consulting income. And on a Tuesday morning in late October, while Derek was conducting a site visit with prospective clients 2 hours away, Natalie drove to an office building she'd never been to and walked into the lobby with a thumb drive containing 243 pages of documentation. The attorney's name was Rebecca Winters. She was 50-something, with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes that tracked details the way Natalie imagined her own once had. "Thank you for seeing me," Natalie said, settling into the chair across from Rebecca's desk. "Of course. You mentioned on the phone this involved business assets and potential concealment. Tell me what's going on." Natalie handed her the thumb drive. "I think it's easier if you just look." Rebecca plugged it in, opened the files, and spent 40 minutes reading in silence. Her expression didn't change, but Natalie saw her eyebrows rise twice, saw her make notes on a legal pad with rapid, efficient strokes. Finally, Rebecca looked up. "Mrs. Brennan, this is extraordinary documentation. How long have you been collecting this?" 6 months, maybe closer to 7 now. "And your husband doesn't know?" "No." "Does he know you're here?" "No." Rebecca sat back, studying Natalie with the kind of assessment that felt clinical, but not unkind. "Can I ask why you're coming to me now? Nothing in this file suggests your husband has filed for divorce yet." "He hasn't, but he's preparing to. I can see the infrastructure being built. He's just waiting for the right moment." "And you want to file first?" "I want to be prepared, so that when the moment comes I'm not reacting, I'm responding." Rebecca's expression shifted into something that might have been approval. "Walk me through what you know about the business formation." Natalie did. The $40,000 inheritance. The incorporation that happened while she was sick. The 2 years of unpaid contract work. The gradual erasure of her contributions from Derek's narrative. The separate accounts, the asset transfers, the careful construction of a financial architecture designed to position Derek's individual wealth while minimizing visible marital assets. Rebecca took notes throughout, asking clarifying questions, occasionally requesting specific documents from the file. When Natalie finished, Rebecca set down her pen. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm going to be very direct with you. This is one of the most well-documented cases of financial positioning I've seen from a non-attorney. The inheritance contribution alone gives us a strong claim to business valuation. The fact that you can prove your labor in the early years, combined with the clear evidence of systematic asset concealment, means we have significant leverage." "What does that mean practically?" "It means that in this state, which follows equitable distribution principles, we can make a very strong case that you're entitled to significant marital assets, including a substantial portion of the business value. Your husband has been operating under the assumption that the business is solely his because the incorporation documents say so. But formation documents aren't the whole story when one spouse contributed capital and labor." Natalie felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, exactly. More like confirmation that her understanding of the situation had been accurate. "How does this usually proceed?" she asked. Rebecca pulled out a timeline document and walked Natalie through the process. Filing, service, disclosure, negotiation, or litigation. The ugly machinery of legal dissolution. "The advantage you have," Rebecca said, "is preparation. Your husband has been planning his exit, but he's been arrogant about it. He's left documentation everywhere. He's assumed you weren't paying attention. That assumption is going to be very expensive for him." "I don't want revenge," Natalie said quietly. "I just want what's fair, what I'm entitled to, what I contributed." That's the best possible position to negotiate from. Judges respond well to parties who are seeking equity rather than punishment. Rebecca paused. "When do you want to file?" Natalie had thought about this. "He has a major business deal closing, probably within the next few weeks. He's been working toward it for months. It will triple the company valuation. And you want to wait until after it closes?" "Yes." Rebecca smiled. a thin expression that held no warmth but considerable respect. That's strategically sound. Once the deal closes, the business value is established and demonstrable. He can't argue it's speculative or uncertain, the number is fixed. Exactly. All right, we'll prepare everything now. Draft the petition, organize the documentation, get ready for filing, and when you give me the word that the deal has closed, we'll serve him within 24 hours. They discussed retainer fees, Natalie paid from her consulting account, and next steps. Rebecca asked if Natalie had somewhere safe to go if Derek's reaction was volatile. He won't be violent, Natalie said with certainty. He'll be angry that his plan got disrupted, but Derek's always controlled, he won't lose his composure. Still, Rebecca said, have a backup plan, just in case. Natalie nodded. She already had one. She drove home carefully, her mind processing the meeting's implications. For the first time in months, Natalie felt something close to calm. Not happiness. The situation was too sad for that. The dissolution of 7 years too significant. But clarity, the particular peace that comes from having a plan. Derek had spent months positioning himself for an exit on his terms. He'd moved money, hidden assets, built infrastructure to protect his individual interests. He'd done all of this while assuming Natalie was too occupied with household management, too trusting, too naive to notice. But Natalie had noticed everything. And while Derek had been planning his future, she'd been planning hers. The difference was that Derek had never thought to look for it. That evening, Derek came home energized. We got verbal confirmation, he said, sweeping Natalie into an uncharacteristic hug. The deal is going to close. Final signatures scheduled for November 15th. 3-year engagement, $4.8 million in total revenue, transformative for the firm. Derek, that's incredible, Natalie said, and she meant it. She'd never wanted his business to fail. She just wanted recognition for her part in building it. We should celebrate, he said. Real celebration. I'll make reservations somewhere nice. I'd like that. He pulled back, looking at her with something that might have been affection or might have been relief that she was still playing the role he'd assigned her. You've been so patient with all of this. I know I've been distracted, but it's going to pay off, all of it. Natalie smiled. I believe you. And she did. Just not in the way he thought. November 15th. Less than a month away. Natalie had waited years in a marriage that had slowly erased her. She could wait 1 more month. And then she'd file. Not with anger. Not with drama. Just with 243 pages of documentation and an attorney who understood exactly how expensive Derek's assumptions were about to become. Derek thought she'd never find out what he was planning. But Natalie had been paying attention all along. She'd just been quiet about it. November 15th arrived with cold rain and low clouds. Natalie woke before her alarm, Derek still sleeping beside her, and felt the particular clarity that comes from knowing everything is about to change. Today the deal would close. Derek would sign contracts that guaranteed his firm $4.8 million over 3 years. The business valuation would triple, fixed and demonstrable, no longer speculative, and tomorrow, Natalie would file. She made coffee while Derek showered, the morning routine so practiced it required no conscious thought. He came downstairs wearing his best suit, the charcoal one he saved for significant occasions, already distracted by whatever mental checklist he was running. You look perfect, she said, straightening his tie though it didn't need straightening. Big day, he said, kissing her cheek with the absent affection of habit. I'll call you after the signatures are done. I'll be waiting. He left in a rush of energy and expensive cologne. Natalie watched from the window as his car pulled away, then went upstairs and called Rebecca Winters. It's happening today, she said when the attorney answered. The deal closing. Yes. He just left for the final meeting. All right. Rebecca's voice was calm, professional. I'll prepare everything for filing first thing tomorrow morning. We'll have him served at his office by noon. Are you ready for this? I've been ready for months. Good. Remember what we discussed. After he's served, he'll likely try to contact you immediately. You're under no obligation to speak with him without counsel present. In fact, I'd advise you not to. I understand. And Natalie, Rebecca paused. You've done everything right. You documented thoroughly, you prepared carefully, and you're seeking equity, not revenge. That's going to serve you well in what comes next. After they hung up, Natalie stood in her kitchen, the house silent around her, and took inventory of what she felt. Not anger. Not anymore. That had burned through months ago, leaving something colder and more purposeful in its wake. Not fear exactly, though there was certainly apprehension about the disruption ahead. Mostly what she felt was a kind of tired relief. Relief that the pretending would end. That she could stop performing the role of a woman who didn't know her husband was planning to leave her. That she could finally use her voice after years of strategic quietness. The performance had been exhausting. She spent the day working on a consulting project, answering emails, preparing a competitive analysis for a client's investor presentation. The work focused her mind, gave her hands something useful to do. At 3:47 p.m., Derek called. "It's done." His voice was electric with triumph. "Everything signed. The contract is executed. We're official." "Derek, that's wonderful." Natalie injected warmth into her tone, the performance continuing for one more night. "I'm so proud of you. I'm taking everyone out for drinks. Celebration with the team. I'll probably be late. Of course. Celebrate. You've earned it. I was thinking we should throw a party this weekend. Big one. Everyone we know. Really mark the moment. That sounds perfect." She could hear voices in the background, laughter, the ambient sound of people riding high on professional victory. "I have to go," Derek said. "But Natalie, seriously, thank you. For holding down everything while I built this. I know I don't say it enough, but I couldn't have done this without you." The words might have meant something years ago. Now they just felt like confirmation that Derek understood on some level that Natalie had contributed to his success. He just thought thank you was sufficient compensation. "You're welcome," she said, and ended the call. That evening she made herself dinner, poured a glass of wine she barely touched, and sat in the living room as darkness fell outside. Tomorrow everything would shift. Derek would be served with divorce papers, and a forensic accounting that detailed every asset he'd tried to hide. His careful planning would collide with hers. The narrative he'd constructed, where he was the sole architect of his success, and Natalie was the supportive wife who'd willingly stepped back, that narrative would fracture under documented truth. Natalie wasn't looking forward to it exactly. There was no satisfaction in dissolution, no victory in the ending of something she'd once believed would last. But there was a certain grim necessity to it. Derek had made his choices. He'd moved money, hidden accounts, built infrastructure for a future that didn't include her. He'd edited Natalie out of their shared history, reduced her contributions to a footnote, assumed she'd never notice or never care or never have the capacity to respond. Those assumptions were about to become very expensive. Derek came home after 11, flushed with alcohol and celebration. He was expansive, generous, pulling Natalie into a hug that smelled like whiskey and triumph. "This is it," he said, his words slightly blurred. "This is what it was all for. All the late nights, all the risk, all the sacrifice. It paid off." "I'm glad," Natalie said, and extracted herself gently. "You should get some sleep. Big day tomorrow too, I imagine." "Yeah, lots to organize. Implementation planning, team restructuring." He was already moving toward the stairs, his mind racing ahead to logistics. "But first, this weekend, big party. I want everyone to see what we've built. The pronoun felt like a joke, but Natalie didn't laugh. She helped him upstairs, made sure he had water on the nightstand, and listened as his breathing deepened into sleep within minutes. Then she went back downstairs, opened her laptop, and sent Rebecca Winters a brief email. "It's done. File tomorrow." The reply came within minutes. "I'll see you at 9 a.m. to review final documents. Service will happen by noon." Natalie closed her laptop, rinsed her wine glass, and went through the mechanical routine of preparing for bed. Tomorrow, Derek would wake up thinking his plan had succeeded. He'd secured the deal. The business was worth millions. His separate accounts were positioned. His exit strategy was in place. He'd have no idea that Natalie had been building her own strategy for the past 7 months. That she'd documented everything. That she'd retained counsel. That she'd been planning all along. He thought she'd never find out. That was his last mistake. November 16th was clear and cold. Natalie met Rebecca Winters at her office at 9 in the morning to review the final petition documents. The paperwork was precise, methodical, devastating in its thoroughness. It outlined the complete financial picture, including every account Derek had established separately, every transfer he'd made from marital assets, every piece of the business infrastructure Natalie had helped build. It included a detailed accounting of her $40,000 inheritance contribution, her 2 years of unpaid contract labor, and her ongoing professional income that Derek knew nothing about. The filing requested equitable distribution of all marital property, including significant allocation of business value based on Natalie's capital contribution and labor. It requested temporary support. It requested full financial disclosure under penalty of perjury. "This is good," Natalie said, reading through the pages. "It's more than good," Rebecca replied. "It's airtight. Your documentation makes this one of the strongest positions I've worked with. Are you ready?" "Yes." They filed electronically at 9:47 a.m. At 11:30, a professional process server arrived at Derek's office building. Natalie wasn't there to see it, but Rebecca called afterward with a report from the server. Mr. Brennan had accepted service in the lobby. He'd gone pale while reading the first page. He'd asked if this was some kind of mistake. The server had confirmed it was official and legal and properly executed. Derek had stood there for several minutes reading, before walking back to the elevator without saying anything else. Natalie listened to this description while sitting in her car in a parking lot 3 miles from their house. She'd driven away that morning after Derek left for work, not wanting to be home when he received the news, not wanting the confrontation to happen on his terms or in his timing. "How long until he calls me?" Natalie asked. "I'd give it less than an hour," Rebecca said. "Remember, you don't have to answer. You don't have to explain anything. You have legal representation. Any communication should go through me." "I understand." But Derek called within 20 minutes. Natalie watched her phone vibrate on the passenger seat. She let it go to voicemail. He called again immediately. Then again. On the 4th call, she answered but said nothing. "Natalie." Derek's voice was tight, controlled, dangerous in its restraint. "What the hell is this? You were served." "I know I was served. I'm asking what the hell this is. This filing? These accusations? This forensic accounting of accounts that are none of your business. They're marital assets, Derek. That makes them my business." How did you?" He stopped, recalibrating. "We need to talk about this. In person. Right now." No. "I have legal representation. Any communication should go through my attorney." "Your attorney? When did you even—" He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it held any humor. "This is insane. You're being emotional. If we just sit down and talk about this reasonably." "I don't think you want to talk reasonably, Derek. I think you want to talk me out of this. But I've been planning this for 7 months. I know about the accounts. All of them. I know about the business structure. I know about the asset transfers. I know everything." Silence on the other end. Natalie could almost see him processing, recalculating, trying to figure out what she actually knew versus what she was bluffing about. "How long?" he said finally, his voice strange. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to document everything. Long enough to retain counsel. Long enough to wait until your deal closed so the business valuation would be fixed and demonstrable." Another silence, longer this time. "You waited," Derek said slowly. "You knew and you waited until after the deal closed. You've been planning this." "Yes." "For months." "Yes." "While I was—" He didn't finish the sentence. Natalie heard something shift in his breathing, some edge between anger and something that might have been fear. "The accounts. You know about those too. I have copies of every statement, Derek. Every transfer, every asset you tried to hide. It's all documented. It's all in the filing, and it's all going to be subject to equitable distribution. Natalie, listen to me." His voice changed, took on the persuasive quality he used in client presentations. "You're upset. I understand. But we can work this out. We don't need attorneys and filings and all this drama. Just come home. Let's talk about this like adults. I am being an adult, Derek. I'm protecting my interests. The same way you've been protecting yours for the past year. I don't know what you think you know, but I know you've been preparing to divorce me. I know you've been moving assets into accounts I wasn't supposed to find. I know you've been building an exit strategy. The only difference is that I found out, and I moved faster." She heard him exhale, a long, controlled breath. "Fine," he said, his voice cold now. "If that's how you want to do this, but you need to understand something, Natalie. That business, the firm, that's mine. I built it. Those assets you're talking about, I earned them. You've been sitting at home for 7 years while I worked 80-hour weeks. You don't get to show up now and claim half of what I built. And there it was. The truth he'd been too careful to say out loud before. The belief that had been driving his planning all along. Natalie felt something settle in her chest, cold and final. "Derek," she said quietly. "My grandmother's $40,000 founded that business. I worked contracts for 2 years while you built client relationships. The business exists because of my capital and my labor, but you incorporated it solely in your name while I was sick with pneumonia. You wrote me out of the legal structure, and then you spent years writing me out of the story entirely. That's not." Derek started. "I have emails from clients thanking me by name for deliverables I created. I have documentation of every contribution I made, and I have a very good attorney who spent months preparing for exactly this conversation. So no, Derek, I won't come home to talk reasonably. I won't let you explain away the evidence. And I won't disappear quietly so you can keep the narrative you've been telling yourself where you're the sole architect of your success." She heard him breathing on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely. The charm was gone. The persuasion was gone. What remained was something harder. "You're going to regret this, maybe," Natalie said. "But I regret more the years I spent making myself quiet so you'd have room to be loud. Goodbye, Derek." She ended the call, turned off her phone, and sat in her car with her hands shaking. It was done. The truth was out. Derek knew she knew. And whatever happened next, Natalie had stopped performing. She drove to a coffee shop she'd never been to, ordered tea she didn't drink, and sat by the window watching people move through their ordinary days. She felt hollowed out and strangely light, as if some weight she'd been carrying for years had finally been set down. Her phone, when she turned it back on an hour later, showed 17 missed calls from Derek and 4 from numbers she didn't recognize. There were text messages too, dozens of them, the tone evolving from anger to bargaining to something that looked like panic. She deleted them without reading past the first few lines. "Rebecca called in the late afternoon. His attorney contacted me," Rebecca said. "They want to schedule a mediation meeting. All ready." He's scared. The filing caught him completely off guard. He didn't know you knew about the accounts, didn't know you documented everything. Now he's trying to regain control of the situation. Rebecca paused. "His attorney asked me where you got your information. I told him that wasn't relevant. He asked if you'd hired an investigator. I said our documentation methods were our business." Natalie smiled despite everything. "What happens next?" "We wait. We let him panic a little. We respond to discovery requests with the mountain of evidence you've compiled. And we negotiate from a position of strength, because he knows now that we can prove concealment, and judges don't look kindly on that. How long does this usually take? Depends on whether he wants to litigate or settle. Given that he just closed a major deal and has a professional reputation to maintain, my guess is he'll push for settlement. He won't want this dragged out in court where all his financial maneuvering becomes public record." Natalie closed her eyes, leaning back against the headboard of the hotel bed she'd checked into that morning. "I just want what's fair, what I contributed. I don't want to destroy him. I know." Rebecca's voice was gentle. "And that's going to work in your favor. But Natalie, you need to prepare yourself. He's going to try every angle he can think of. He's going to tell people you're being unreasonable. He's going to control the narrative with everyone you both know. This is going to get harder before it gets easier." "I understand." "Good. Get some rest." "And Natalie, you did everything right. You prepared, you documented, and you chose your moment strategically. That took extraordinary discipline." After they hung up, Natalie lay in the unfamiliar hotel bed and stared at the ceiling. She'd spent 7 months being strategic, being patient, building her case brick by brick. The restraint had been necessary. But now that the truth was out, now that Derek knew she'd been planning all along, Natalie felt something she hadn't expected. Grief. Not for Derek. Not for the marriage as it had been, which had slowly eroded into performance and erasure. But for the version of their future she'd once believed in, the partnership she'd thought they were building. The trust she'd extended so completely that its betrayal still felt disorienting. She'd lost that future months ago, she knew. The moment Derek had started moving money into hidden accounts, the moment he'd started planning his exit, their shared future had already ended. Natalie had just been the last one to let go of it. Now she had, and tomorrow she'd start building something different. Something that was entirely hers. Word spread faster than Natalie had anticipated. By the end of the first week, 3 mutual friends had called, their voices careful, probing for information. Is everything okay? We heard something happened. Derek mentioned you two were having difficulties. Natalie kept her responses brief. We're divorcing. I've retained counsel. I can't really discuss details. She didn't explain. Didn't justify. Didn't try to control the narrative the way Derek undoubtedly was in his circles. And the restraint paid off. Because while Derek was telling his version, the people who knew Natalie, really knew her, started noticing inconsistencies. Her friend Lauren called on a Thursday evening. I had coffee with Derek's business partner, Michael, she said without preamble. He asked me if I knew you'd been involved in the early business development, said he'd always assumed Derek founded the company with family money, but never knew whose family. Natalie said nothing, waiting. So I told him what I remembered. Lauren continued. That you'd inherited money from your grandmother right before Derek started the firm, that you'd worked in equity analysis and did contract work in the beginning. And Michael got very quiet. Then he asked if you'd been at the incorporation. I said I didn't know, but I knew you'd been sick that winter. Lauren paused. Natalie, he apologized. To me, for you. Said he'd never questioned the business origin story, because Derek told it with such certainty. But now he's wondering what else he never questioned. After that call, others followed. People asking questions. People who'd known Natalie before she'd married Derek, who remembered her professional competence, who'd watched her gradually become quieter over the years without quite noticing the change until it was complete. The narrative Derek had constructed, where he was the singular genius and Natalie was the supportive wife who'd voluntarily stepped back, that narrative started developing cracks, not because Natalie was fighting to correct it, but because people were finally paying attention. 2 weeks after filing, Natalie met Lauren and 2 other close friends for coffee. It was the first time she'd seen them since the separation became public knowledge. They hugged her carefully as if she might break. She assured them she wouldn't. How are you really? Lauren asked when they'd settled into a corner table. Tired, Natalie said honestly. But okay. Better than I've been in a while, actually. We were worried. Sarah, another friend, reached across to squeeze Natalie's hand. You've been so quiet lately. We thought maybe, I don't know, that you were just busy or something. We didn't realize things were bad. They weren't bad in obvious ways. Natalie wrapped her hands around her teacup. They were just empty. I'd become invisible in my own life. And I didn't realize it until I started trying to become visible again. The divorce, Lauren said carefully. Derek's telling people it came out of nowhere. That you blindsided him. Natalie smiled without humor. I'm sure that's what it felt like to him. But I didn't blindside him. I just stopped accepting the version of reality where only his plans mattered. Sarah leaned forward. Michael told his wife that you have documentation of separate accounts Derek established. Financial stuff Derek never mentioned. I documented everything I found, Natalie said simply. I wasn't trying to trap him. I was trying to protect myself. Good. Lauren's voice was fierce. You should protect yourself. You've spent years protecting everyone else's comfort. The conversation continued, warm and supportive in ways Natalie hadn't expected. She'd been prepared for judgment, for people taking sides, for the social awkwardness of divorce playing out in mutual friendships. Instead, what she found was recognition. Her friends had noticed her disappearing, even if they hadn't named it at the time. Now they were seeing her re-emerge, and the relief in their voices suggested they'd missed the version of Natalie who spoke her mind and took up space. I got offered a full-time consulting position, Natalie mentioned as they were preparing to leave, with a firm that does competitive analysis. It's remote, good salary, intellectually challenging work. Wait. Sarah stopped midway through putting on her coat. When did this happen? I've been consulting freelance for about 8 months. Built up a client base. One of them offered to bring me on permanently. 8 months. Lauren was staring at her. You've been working for 8 months and Derek didn't know. He never asked what I did with my time during the day. So I didn't tell him. The 3 women looked at each other, then at Natalie. Sarah started laughing first, a surprised burst of sound that made other coffee shop patrons turn to look. I'm sorry, Sarah said, still laughing. It's not funny. It's just, Derek had no idea. None. Natalie confirmed, "That's incredible." Lauren shook her head. "You rebuilt your entire professional identity and he never noticed. He noticed what he expected to see," Natalie said quietly. "A wife who'd stepped back, who managed the house, who didn't have ambitions of her own anymore. He saw what fit his narrative and ignored everything else." Walking back to her car afterward, Natalie felt something shift. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of quiet vindication. She'd spent years making herself smaller to accommodate Derek's expansion. And she'd almost accepted that as permanent, almost believed that the professional, competent version of herself was gone. But she'd never actually lost that person. She'd just been quiet. And now, as word continued spreading through their social circle, as people started asking questions and noticing inconsistencies and reassessing assumptions, Natalie realized something important. She didn't need to fight for recognition. She just needed to stop hiding. The legal process ground forward through December. Derek's attorney produced financial disclosures that were notably incomplete. Rebecca filed a motion to compel full discovery. Derek's attorney requested mediation. Rebecca agreed but insisted on full asset disclosure first. It was technical, procedural, bloodless in its formality. But underneath the legal language, Derek was panicking. He called Natalie directly despite Rebecca's instructions that all communication should go through counsel. She didn't answer. He sent emails that started conciliatory and became angry when she didn't respond. He showed up at the house one evening while she was there collecting more personal items. She'd brought Lauren with her as a witness. Derek had looked between them, seemed to recognize the situation was not negotiable, and left without saying much beyond, "We need to talk about this eventually." Eventually, Natalie had agreed. Through our attorneys. The turning point came in early January during a mediation session Natalie attended with Rebecca. Derek and his attorney sat across the conference table. Derek looked diminished somehow, as if the past 2 months had worn away the polished confidence he'd always carried. The mediator walked through the asset inventory. The business, now demonstrably worth $6 million post-deal. The house, the retirement accounts, the separate accounts Derek had established, which he'd been forced to disclose in full. When they reached the business valuation, Derek's attorney argued that Natalie's contribution had been minimal, that her $40,000 had been a gift, not an investment, that she had no claim to assets Derek had built through his own labor. Rebecca calmly produced documentation, the inheritance deposit, email records of Natalie's contract work, client testimonials from the firm's early years thanking Natalie by name, the incorporation documents showing Derek had handled the filing while Natalie was incapacitated, a timeline demonstrating that Natalie had worked without compensation for the first 2 years. Then she produced something else. A recording from a dinner party 6 months earlier where Derek had explicitly told a colleague that he couldn't have built the business without Natalie's support in the early years. His own words, acknowledging her contribution. Derek's face went pale. The mediator suggested a break. When they reconvened an hour later, Derek's attorney proposed a settlement offer. Natalie would receive 35% of the business value, full equity in the house, and equal division of all other marital assets. Rebecca countered with 45% of the business, given Natalie's capital contribution and labor, plus equitable division of everything else. They settled at 42% and equal division. The paperwork would take weeks to finalize, but the outcome was decided. Natalie walked out of that conference room knowing that Derek had just agreed to terms he'd spent a year trying to avoid. He'd positioned assets, hidden accounts, built careful infrastructure for an exit that would minimize her share. And she dismantled all of it with documentation and patience. Later that evening, Rebecca called. "You did it," she said, satisfaction clear in her voice. "You got a fair settlement. More than fair, actually. And you did it by being prepared, strategic, and focused on equity rather than punishment. I just wanted what I contributed," Natalie said. "I know. And that's why you won." After they hung up, Natalie sat in her hotel room, the one she'd been living in for nearly 2 months, and let herself feel the weight of it. She'd won. Not in the sense of destroying Derek or taking revenge, but in the sense of being recognized, of having her contributions acknowledged legally and financially, of reclaiming what she'd built. The victory was quiet. There would be no public celebration, no moment of dramatic confrontation where she proved Derek wrong in front of everyone. Just a settlement agreement that put numbers to her value. That said, her labor mattered. Her capital mattered. She mattered. For years, Derek had controlled the narrative, had edited her out of their shared story, had assumed she'd accept whatever role he assigned her. And now the legal system, forced to examine evidence rather than accept narrative, had affirmed what Natalie had known all along. She'd been essential, not decorative, not secondary. Essential. Derek had just never wanted to see it. 6 months later, Natalie sat in her new apartment unpacking the last boxes from storage. The divorce had finalized in March. The settlement had been executed. Derek had bought out her business share in a lump sum payment that let her walk away cleanly. She'd taken the house equity and used it as a down payment on a smaller place that was entirely hers. The apartment was bright, 4th floor with windows facing east. She'd furnished it simply, pieces chosen for her taste rather than to coordinate with Derek's aesthetic preferences or accommodate his needs. It was the first space she'd lived in as an adult that belonged only to her. Natalie pulled her grandmother's jewelry box from the packing materials, the one she'd moved to storage nearly a year ago when she'd first started preparing. She opened it carefully, touching the pearl necklace her grandmother had worn to church every Sunday, the cameo brooch, the simple gold band from a marriage that had lasted 47 years. "I built something," Natalie said quietly to the memory of her grandmother. "Not what I thought I was building, but something good anyway." The full-time consulting position had started in February. Natalie worked from home most days, video calls with clients, deep analysis work that used all the skills she'd set aside 7 years earlier. The firm had been impressed with her strategic thinking, her attention to detail, her ability to find patterns others missed. She was good at this work. She'd always been good at it. She'd just forgotten for a while. Her phone rang. Lauren, asking if she wanted to meet for dinner. "I'm still unpacking," Natalie said, looking around at the half-empty boxes. "So unpack tomorrow. Come eat food you didn't have to cook and tell me about the new place." Natalie smiled. "Okay. Give me an hour." After they hung up, she continued unpacking, finding rhythms in the simple task. Here was the coffee maker that was hers, not theirs. Here were books she'd packed away because Derek thought they cluttered the living room. Here were photographs from before her marriage, versions of herself she'd almost forgotten existed. She'd lost things in the divorce. 7 years of her life, the vision of partnership she'd believed in, the trust that had taken years to build and moments to shatter. But she'd gained things too. Clarity about her own value. Professional identity rebuilt and thriving. Financial independence secured through her own strategic planning. Space to be herself without performing for someone else's comfort. And perhaps most importantly, her voice back. There was a moment in the late afternoon when Natalie stood by the window, looking out over the city, and realized she felt peaceful. Not happy in some uncomplicated way. The past year had been too hard for that. The dissolution too painful, but peaceful in the sense of being settled in her own skin again, of knowing what she was worth, of no longer making herself quiet for someone else's benefit. Derek had sent one email after the divorce finalized. It was brief, formal, professional. He hoped she was doing well. He acknowledged that things had not ended as either of them would have wanted. He wished her success in her future endeavors. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the asset concealment, or the years of narrative erasure, or the careful planning for an exit that would have left her with far less than she'd contributed. But Natalie hadn't expected those things. Derek genuinely believed his version of their story. He'd convinced himself that the business was solely his creation, that Natalie's contributions had been negligible, that his success was individual rather than shared. He'd believed it so completely that he'd never thought to question whether she might see things differently. That belief had cost him approximately $2.5 million when the settlement was calculated. Natalie had not responded to his email. There was nothing left to say. She'd said everything that mattered in the filing, in the documentation, in the mediation where her evidence had spoken louder than his narrative. That evening, Natalie met Lauren at a restaurant they'd gone to years ago, before Natalie's marriage, when they'd been young professionals sharing an apartment and figuring out their careers. "You look different," Lauren said when Natalie slid into the booth across from her. "Different how?" "Present. Like you're actually here, instead of thinking about 17 other things you need to manage." Natalie smiled. "I'm working on that. Being present." They ordered food and talked about inconsequential things at first. Lauren's job, her sister's upcoming wedding, a movie they both wanted to see. Then Lauren said carefully, I saw Derek last week. At that networking event I told you about. Natalie's stomach tightened reflexively, but she kept her voice level. How did he seem? Smaller somehow. Lauren played with her napkin. He was talking to people, doing his networking thing. But it was like, I don't know, like he was trying too hard. Like he didn't trust that people would be interested without him performing for them. Natalie considered this. She'd spent years watching Derek perform. The charm, the certainty, the carefully constructed authority. She'd thought it was genuine confidence. Only later had she recognized it as something more fragile, something that required constant validation and control. Did he ask about me? No. I think he knows better. But Natalie, Lauren met her eyes. People know. Not all the details, but enough. They know you had documentation. They know he'd been hiding assets. They know the settlement was substantial. And the people who matter, the ones who actually know you, they're glad you stood up for yourself. I didn't stand up for myself, Natalie said quietly. I just stopped lying down. Lauren smiled. Same thing. The food arrived and they ate, the conversation moving to easier topics. But later, walking back to her car, Natalie thought about what Lauren had said. People knew. The truth had gotten out, not because Natalie had fought to broadcast it, but because documentation was harder to dismiss than narrative. Because Derek's story had inconsistencies that people finally noticed when they started looking. She'd been recognized, not dramatically, not with some public moment of vindication, but in the quiet acknowledgement that she'd contributed, that she'd been erased, and that she'd reclaimed her value through preparation and strategic patience. That was enough. Back at her apartment, Natalie made tea and sat by the window as the sun set. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, quietly documenting bank statements and learning Derek's patterns of deception. That woman had been scared, grieving, determined. She thought about the woman she'd been 7 years ago, excited about partnership and building a shared future. That woman had been naive, trusting, generous with her belief in others. And she thought about the woman she was now, scarred by betrayal but stronger for surviving it, financially independent, professionally valued, clear about her boundaries and her worth. She'd lost a marriage, but she'd reclaimed herself. That was not a trade she regretted. Her phone buzzed with a message from her consulting firm's senior partner, asking if she could take on a new project, high-profile client, excellent compensation. Natalie read the message twice, feeling the particular satisfaction of being wanted for her expertise. Yes. She typed back, "Send me the details." Then she set her phone down, finished her tea, and looked around at the apartment that was entirely hers. The life she'd thought she was building with Derek had ended. That future was gone, dissolved in legal proceedings and settlement agreements. But a different future had opened, one where Natalie's voice mattered, where her contributions were recognized, where she wasn't performing quietness to make room for someone else's noise. She'd spent years being silent because she thought that was what partnership required. Now she understood the difference between strategic quietness and enforced silence, between choosing to listen and being written out of the conversation entirely. Derek had thought her quietness meant she wasn't paying attention. That assumption had been expensive. But more than that, it had been wrong. Natalie had been paying attention to everything. She'd just been quiet about it. And when she'd finally chosen to speak, she'd done it with 243 pages of documentation and a clarity that narrative couldn't dismiss. That was power. Not the loud, performative kind that demanded constant validation, but the quiet, foundational kind that didn't need to be proven because it simply was. Natalie Brennan had reclaimed that power. And she would never make herself small for someone else's comfort again. If you've stayed with Natalie's story this long, perhaps something in it resonated with you. Perhaps you've felt that particular exhaustion that comes from making yourself quiet in a life that only has room for one voice. Perhaps you've noticed the way your contributions get edited out of shared stories, the way your labor becomes invisible precisely because you perform it so well. Perhaps you've wondered when accommodation became erasure, when supporting someone else's success started requiring the disappearance of your own. Natalie's story isn't just about one woman and one marriage. It's about the cost of silence when silence stops being your choice. There's a difference between strategic quietness and enforced erasure. Quietness can be powerful when you choose it, when you're watching and learning and preparing. But when your quietness becomes someone else's requirement, when you're expected to stay small so someone else can feel large, that's not partnership. That's diminishment. And here's what Natalie understood that saved her. She recognized the difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is hot and immediate and visible. It gives away your position. It lets the other person control the timeline and prepare their defenses. Responding is cold and strategic and patient. It means you prepare thoroughly, you document carefully, and you move when you're ready, not when you're provoked. The people who benefit from your invisibility will never voluntarily give you visibility. You have to reclaim it. And that reclamation doesn't require drama or confrontation or burning everything down. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop performing. Stop managing everyone else's comfort. Stop accepting a narrative that erases your contributions. Just stop. And in that stopping, in that refusal to continue participating in your own diminishment, you create space for truth. If you're living in a situation where someone assumes you don't notice what they're hiding, document everything. Not out of paranoia, but out of self-respect. Information is only powerful if you have it when you need it. And people who are carefully positioning assets or controlling narratives are assuming you won't look closely. Prove them wrong. Your silence should serve you, not someone else's comfort. If you find yourself getting quieter and smaller in a relationship, in a job, in any situation, ask yourself whether that quietness is strategic or whether it's been required of you. Because the moment you start disappearing to make room for someone else, you've stopped being a partner and become a supporting character in someone else's story. Natalie waited. She prepared. She built her case brick by brick over 7 months. That took extraordinary discipline. But it also meant that when she finally spoke, she spoke once with a voice so clear and so supported by evidence that no one could rewrite her truth. That's not revenge. That's reclamation. And there's a profound difference. Revenge is about hurting the person who hurt you. Reclamation is about taking back what was yours all along. Your value, your contributions, your voice, your future. Natalie didn't destroy Derek. She just stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. She stopped managing his comfort. She stopped accepting his version of reality. And in that withdrawal of her accommodation, the structure he'd built on her invisible labor simply collapsed. So if this story resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in Natalie's gradual disappearance or her strategic preparation or her quiet reclamation of self, here's what I want you to take away. You are not required to stay small so someone else can feel big. You are not required to stay quiet so someone else can control the narrative. And you are not required to accept being erased from your own story. Document your contributions. Know your value. Build your foundation. And when the time comes, choose yourself with the same care and attention you've been giving to everyone else. Because the people who truly value you won't require your silence. They won't benefit from your invisibility. They won't mistake your accommodation for your capacity. And the ones who do, well, let them learn what Natalie taught Derek. That quiet people aren't necessarily unaware people. That patience isn't the same as passivity. And that the person you've been ignoring might have been paying attention all along. Your voice matters. Use it when it serves you, not when it serves someone else. If Natalie's story reminded you that your voice matters, that your contributions deserve recognition, that strategic patience can be more powerful than immediate reaction, then this might be the kind of story you need more of in your life. At Silent Mind Stories, we share journeys of people who chose dignity over drama, who reclaimed their power through preparation rather than performance, who understood that the quietest victories often echo the longest. These are stories about people who refused to stay small, who documented instead of confronting, who responded instead of reacting, who knew their worth even when others tried to erase it. If that resonates with you, subscribe to Silent Mind Stories. Because every week, we bring you another journey of quiet strength, strategic patience, and the particular power that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next story.